But what is the role of monarchs, really, in today's world? Well, to discuss this, we are now joined by Dr Emmanuel Matambo, an International Relations Analyst. Doctor, a good morning to you, and thank you so much for joining us. I mean, when you looked at the world's response to the death of Queen Elizabeth, what were your thoughts around, really, the role of monarchies in modern day?
Thank you very much, and good morning to your viewers as well. Well, the role of monarchs in the world of today remains a sentimental preoccupation, especially for countries such as the United Kingdom and Spain. But what is of utmost importance here is the difference between constitutional monarchs and absolute monarchs. So if you look at constitutional monarchs such as the United Kingdom's monarchy, for example, those are more palatable into today's world where the constitution and the law dictates who should be in power, and that the head of state is only a figurehead in most cases. Now, that is a different case when it comes to absolute monarchs, such as in the Kingdom of Eswatini, for example, where the monarch reigns supreme even over law and everything. So that is a major difference. There is still a role that a monarch can play as a person of a moral compass, so to say, a moral conscience of the kingdom, and that was the case in the United Kingdom, and that is why a lot of people can live with that rather than with an absolute monarch.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly something to be said about the example that we see from the UK in being able to operate as a democratic state and still be able to uphold it. But is this a model that we can see duplicated in other parts of the world? And where have we seen monarchs outside of in the UK really be quite successful in leading their people?
Well, I think the trend is showing that there is a reduction in people's sentimentality towards having a monarchy. And I mean, we can use the United Kingdom itself as an example. When Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne, the United Kingdom had about 70 overseas territories. Today, the Commonwealth realms outside the United Kingdom only remain about 14, of which 6 are now seeking to be Republicans. So in as much as this has been economically successful anyway, we have seen that the trend now is towards overseas territories decoupling themselves from the United Kingdom.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you raised, because with the news coming out yesterday of the passing of Queen Elizabeth, it was really difficult to ignore the contrast of the conversations that were being had in South Africa, right? Those that were sending their condolences, and those that talked about the legacy of the Queen as well, being one that perhaps is a negative one. What is it exactly that we as South Africans really should be taking from the legacy of Queen Elizabeth for ourselves?
Well, the first thing that we should understand is accountability. And the 6 countries that are agitating for republicanism now in the Caribbean only want an apology from the royal family and an acknowledgement that that slavery was an evil that should never have happened. Now, this partially happened in March when Prince William visited Jamaica. He expressed sorrow, profound sorrow and regret that slavery happened at all. But then he stopped short of giving an apology, and that is exactly what the people of Jamaica are agitating for, just an apology and an acknowledgement of how their ancestors were brutalized by colonialism. Here in South Africa, the example that we could take from what has been happening towards the United Kingdom and its monarchy is the fact that our leaders have to be accountable for the wrongs that they do, even the wrongs that were done by past rulers. I mean, that is just what the oppressed people of the world, both slaves and those who have suffered the excesses of bad governance and brutal governance as well, expect and deserve really from those whose actions and those even whose ancestors are majorly responsible for this.
Okay, I think you're struggling to hear me because I've been trying to jump in there for a while. But I'm saying, considering that point that you're making about accountability in leaders, what then do you think is the role of King Charles III moving forward?
Well, he first of all has to pacify the agitations of people in the Caribbean countries and even in New Zealand, where we saw that the Maori party in New Zealand wants New Zealand to be a republican rather than a Commonwealth realm. So Prince William really has a daunting task of trying to accept the accountability and the role of the United Kingdom in slavery in the world, and just the brutal nature of colonialism in the rest of the world. So he has to make sure that obviously he accepts accountability for those actions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for speaking to us. We really, really do appreciate your time. That there was Dr. Emmanuel Matambo, an international relations analyst. And those conversations are going to be continuing, I imagine, over the next 10 days as we look at activities coming out of the UK following the death of the Queen. But let's talk a little bit about that legacy, right? And this is what myself and Emmanuel Matambo have touched on there. The legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. But let's look at that life that she lived. She was born in 1926 on the 21st of April, and a little bit later on, at that point, where the king was King George V, her grandfather, who died on the 20th of January in 1936. Her father, King George VI, then becomes king on the 11th of December in 1936. We get now into the further part of her own life. One of her first official visits as a young woman was really to South Africa for her 21st birthday in 1947. She later married Philip Mountbatten in Westminster on the 20th of November that same year. In 1948, she gave birth to Prince Charles at Buckingham Palace, who now we now address as King Charles III, automatically taking the crown following the death of his mother. In 1952, we go back to her life. In 1952, King George VI, her father, then dies. When that happens, she is in Africa. She's in Kenya, in fact, when that takes place. But immediately, automatically, with the death of her father, she then is called, and her title then becomes Queen Elizabeth II. Her coronation only taking place the next year in Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June in 1953, and she was 27 years old when she became the Queen. If you think about the timeline there, 27 years old, at 70 years at the helm, that is the longest serving monarch in the history of the United Kingdom. In 2022, this year, she celebrated that jubilee, having been on the throne for 70 years. And we remember that massive celebration taking place across the world really earlier this year. And now, a few months later, we now talk about her death and a new era for the United Kingdom.